I was knee-deep in the creek behind my property in Asheville, North Carolina, pulling out another dead trout when I realized this wasn't just bad luck or a natural die-off. The water had a strange chemical smell, and there was a dark, oily residue coating the rocks that hadn't been there 3 days ago. My hands were already stained black from whatever this substance was, and I could see more dead fish floating downstream near the old willow tree that marked the edge of my 5-acre property. My name is Marcus Webb, and I had moved to this slice of paradise in the Blue Ridge Mountains exactly 2 years ago, escaping the corporate grind of Charlotte for something quieter, something real. The creek, officially called Barefoot Run according to county maps, had been one of the main reasons I bought this place. Crystal clear water, native brook trout, the occasional great blue heron fishing in the shallows. It was everything I wanted after 20 years of staring at computer screens in climate-controlled offices. Now it looked like an environmental crime scene. I climbed out of the water, my boots squelching as I made my way up the bank toward my house. The 2-story log cabin sat on a slight rise, giving me a perfect view of the valley below and the creek that wound through my property before continuing onto the nature preserve downstream. I grabbed my phone from the porch and started taking pictures, documenting everything. The dead fish, the discolored water, the black substance coating the stream bed. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural, and it sure as hell wasn't legal. My property was part of the Ridgeview Estates, a development that had gone up about 5 years ago. When I bought in, I knew there was a homeowners association, but the real estate agent had assured me it was pretty hands-off. Just basic stuff about maintaining properties and keeping the neighborhood looking decent. What she hadn't mentioned was that the HOA president, Patricia Hendricks, treated the position like she was running a small dictatorship. Patricia was everything you'd expect from a stereotypical HOA tyrant. Mid-50s, blonde hair that she kept in the same severe bob she probably had in high school, and a disposition that suggested she'd been personally offended by the concept of joy itself. She lived in one of the larger houses near the development entrance, and I'd had exactly 3 interactions with her in 2 years. The first was when she informed me my mailbox was 2 inches too tall, according to HOA regulations. The second was when she cited me for having my trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I'd been actively loading them into my truck. The third was last month when she'd threatened to fine me for allowing native wildflowers to grow in my yard, instead of maintaining a traditional lawn. I'd largely ignored her, figuring that was the best way to deal with petty bureaucrats. Now, looking at my poisoned creek, I had a sinking feeling Patricia and her HOA board were about to become a much bigger problem. I called the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission first, getting transferred twice before reaching someone who seemed to understand the severity of what I was describing. The woman on the phone, who introduced herself as Officer Sarah Chen, told me she'd send someone out that afternoon to assess the situation. Then I called the county environmental health department, going through a similar process and getting a similar response. While I waited, I walked the creek upstream, following it toward the boundary of my property. The development had a large common area that backed up to several properties, including mine. There was a retention pond up there, designed to manage stormwater runoff, and beyond that, the main road that connected our neighborhood to Highway 25. As I got closer to the property line, the contamination got worse. The black substance was thicker here, clumped in places like crude oil, and the chemical smell was strong enough to make my eyes water. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the split rail fence that marked my property line, on HOA common ground, there was a massive pile of what looked like asphalt millings mixed with chunks of old pavement. It had to be at least 20 cubic yards of the stuff, maybe more, dumped in a rough pile about 50 feet from the creek. Except the pile wasn't neat. It was clear that whoever had dumped it hadn't been careful, and a significant amount of the material had rolled or been washed directly into the water. There were tire tracks in the mud, deep ones from a large truck leading from the access road to the dump site. My stomach dropped. This was intentional. Someone had deliberately dumped construction waste on HOA property, probably trying to save money on proper disposal, and it had contaminated the entire creek system downstream. This wasn't just an environmental violation, this was criminal. I took more pictures documenting everything. The pile, the tracks, the path the material had taken into the water. I was so focused on gathering evidence that I didn't hear Patricia approaching until she was already calling out to me. "Mr. Webb, you are on HOA common property without authorization." I turned to see her standing on the access road, arms crossed, wearing what looked like expensive workout clothes despite the fact that I'd never once seen her exercise. She had that pursed lip expression that seemed to be her default setting, like she'd just bitten into a lemon and was determined to pretend she'd enjoyed it. "Patricia, we've got a serious problem." I gestured toward the pile in the creek. Someone dumped asphalt waste on common property, and it's contaminated the entire creek system. "I've got dead fish all over my property, and I've already called wildlife resources and the county." Her expression didn't change. If anything, she looked more annoyed. "The HOA conducted necessary property improvements last week. All work was authorized by the board and completed according to proper procedures." I stared at her. "You authorized dumping construction waste next to a creek. That's illegal. Like, seriously illegal. We're talking environmental crimes, Patricia." "We disposed of excess materials from our road repair project in a cost-effective manner on HOA property," she said, her tone suggesting she was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "The board voted on it. It's completely within our authority." "It's contaminating the waterway," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The creek runs through my property and then into the nature preserve. This affects the entire watershed. You can't just dump asphalt waste wherever you want." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Webb, I suggest you focus on bringing your own property into compliance with HOA standards, rather than questioning the board's decisions. You still have those unsightly native plants in your front yard, and I've received complaints about your vehicles being parked on the grass." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was staring at evidence of environmental contamination and still finding time to threaten me with HOA violations. The Wildlife Resources Commission is sending an officer out this afternoon. When they see this, the HOA is going to have a serious problem. "Then we'll deal with it through proper channels," Patricia said. "Now please remove yourself from common property, or I'll be forced to add trespassing to your growing list of violations." I left, but only because I needed to be at my house when the wildlife officer arrived. As I walked back along the creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that Patricia genuinely didn't understand the magnitude of what had happened. Or worse, she understood perfectly and just didn't care. Officer Chen arrived around 3 in the afternoon, driving a state truck with the Wildlife Resources Commission logo on the door. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of alert, observant expression that suggested she didn't miss much. I met her in my driveway and immediately walked her down to the creek. Her reaction to the contamination was everything Patricia's hadn't been. She crouched at the water's edge, examining the dead fish and the black residue, her expression growing darker by the minute. She pulled out testing equipment from her field kit, taking water samples and photographs with a professional camera that looked a lot more expensive than my phone. "How many dead fish have you found?" She asked, carefully bagging a water sample. At least 30 that I've seen, probably more. They're scattered all along the creek through my property. I haven't checked downstream into the preserve yet. She nodded, making notes on a tablet. I'm seeing trout, some bass, crayfish. This is a pretty diverse aquatic ecosystem, or it was. She looked upstream. You said the source is on HOA property? I led her to the pile, pointing out the tire tracks and the path the material had taken into the water. Officer Chen's jaw tightened as she surveyed the scene. She took more samples, more photographs, documenting everything with meticulous care. This is asphalt millings mixed with chunks of asphalt pavement, she said, examining some of the material. It contains petroleum products, heavy metals, all kinds of contamination. You absolutely cannot dump this near a waterway. It's a direct violation of the Clean Water Act plus state environmental laws. She looked at me. You said the HOA did this. According to the president, Patricia Hendricks, she told me they authorized it for some road repair project. I talked to her less than 2 hours ago and she acted like it wasn't a big deal. Officer Chen shook her head. It's a very big deal. This is criminal. I need to contact the county environmental health department and get them out here. We'll also need to bring in the district attorney's office because we're looking at potential criminal charges. She paused, looking at the contaminated creek. I'm also going to check downstream into the preserve. If this has killed wildlife beyond fish, we're talking about additional charges. We spent the next hour walking the creek, finding more dead fish and documenting the extent of the contamination. By the time we reached the nature preserve boundary, we'd counted over 60 dead fish, plus numerous dead crayfish and what Officer Chen identified as 2 dead salamanders, which apparently were indicators of water quality. When we found a dead raccoon near the water's edge about a quarter mile into the preserve, Officer Chen's expression turned grim. Mammals, she said quietly, photographing the raccoon. That escalates this significantly. If wildlife were drinking from this creek and died as a result, we're talking about major criminal charges. This isn't just an environmental violation anymore. This is potentially criminal negligence causing death of protected wildlife. A man in his 60s wearing khaki pants and a fleece jacket emerged from the trail about 50 yards away. He introduced himself as Robert Martinez, the preserve manager, and he'd been documenting dead fish on his property since early this morning. Officer Chen filled him in on what we'd found, and his reaction was immediate anger. That HOA has been a thorn in our side since the development went in, Robert said. They keep trying to clear-cut trees on the preserve boundary because residents complain about leaves. They've rerouted drainage without permits. Now this. He looked at the dead raccoon. I found a dead doe this morning near the main creek crossing. I thought maybe it was disease, but now I'm wondering if it drank from the contaminated water. Officer Chen made a note. Can you show me? We followed Robert deeper into the preserve, and sure enough, there was a young deer lying dead about 10 feet from the creek. Officer Chen examined it carefully, taking more photographs and samples. The 3 of us stood there in the fading afternoon light, looking at undeniable evidence that the HOA's illegal dumping had caused multiple wildlife deaths. I'm calling this in now, Officer Chen said. We need a full investigation team out here, and we need to get the district attorney involved immediately. This is one of the more serious cases I've seen. She looked at me. Mr. Webb, you're going to need to document everything that happened on your property. Every interaction with the HOA, every dead animal you find, everything. This is going to become a criminal case, and your testimony is going to be crucial. The county environmental health inspector, a middle-aged man named David Thornton, arrived about an hour later. By then, it was getting dark, but he examined the dump site and the contaminated creek using high-powered flashlights. His assessment matched Officer Chen's. The asphalt waste contained numerous contaminants that violated both federal and state clean water laws. The dumping itself violated multiple regulations, and the fact that it had resulted in wildlife deaths made it a criminal matter. "I'm issuing an immediate cease and desist order to the HOA," David said, typing on his tablet. "They need to stop any further dumping, and they're going to be required to conduct a full environmental cleanup under state supervision. We're talking about removing all the asphalt waste, remediating the soil, potentially restoring the entire creek system." He looked at me. "I'm also going to recommend criminal charges. This level of environmental damage doesn't happen by accident." I went home that night exhausted and angry. My peaceful creek property had been transformed into a contamination site, and the HOA that was supposed to be managing our community had committed what appeared to be multiple crimes. I spent the evening typing up everything that had happened, documenting my interactions with Patricia and the timeline of events. The next morning, I woke to find 3 official-looking notices taped to my front door, all from the HOA. One cited me for having unauthorized personnel on common property without board approval, referring to Officer Chen and the other investigators. Another threatened fines for the native plants in my yard. The third informed me that I was being assessed a special fee of $5,000 as part of a community improvement project. I called Officer Chen immediately. She was already at the preserve with a full investigation team, including representatives from the State Environmental Agency and the local district attorney's office. When I told her about the notices, she actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Keep them. They're evidence of harassment and potential retaliation. Don't pay anything, don't respond. Just document it all." Over the next week, the investigation expanded dramatically. The team found that the asphalt dumping was even worse than initially thought. The HOA had actually dumped materials twice over the course of 3 weeks, totaling nearly 50 cubic yards of asphalt waste. They'd done it late at night, using a contractor who wasn't licensed for environmental work. The contractor, when questioned, admitted he'd told the HOA that the dumping was illegal, but Patricia had insisted it was fine because it was on HOA property. She'd paid him $800 cash to dispose of material that would have cost over $4,000 to handle properly at an authorized facility. The environmental team also found elevated levels of petroleum products, heavy metals including lead and chromium, and other contaminants in the creek, stretching for nearly 2 miles downstream from the dump site. The wildlife death toll kept climbing. By the end of the investigation, they documented over 200 dead fish, numerous amphibians, the raccoon, the deer, and a great blue heron that Robert had found dead near one of the preserve ponds. The North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, in coordination with the district attorney's office, filed formal criminal charges against the Ridgeview Estates HOA board. Patricia Hendricks, as president, faced the most serious charges, including multiple counts of violating the Clean Water Act, illegal disposal of hazardous waste, and criminal negligence causing the death of protected wildlife. The other 4 board members, all of whom had voted to authorize the dumping, faced similar but slightly lesser charges. I learned most of this from Officer Chen, who kept me updated as the case developed. She also told me that the HOA was required to immediately begin cleanup and remediation, with costs estimated at over $200,000. The HOA's insurance company was refusing to cover it, arguing that the illegal activity voided their coverage, which meant the costs would likely be assessed against all homeowners in the development. That sparked a revolt in Ridgeview Estates. Most homeowners had no idea what the board had been doing, And when they learned they might be on the hook for hundreds of thousands in cleanup costs plus potential legal liability, they were furious. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and I attended along with probably 75% of the neighborhood. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a building that Patricia had pushed to have built 2 years ago using special assessments. It had cost each homeowner an extra $3,000 and was mostly used for the monthly board meetings and occasional yoga classes. Tonight, it was packed with angry residents, and the mood was hostile from the moment Patricia called the meeting to order. She tried to start with normal HOA business, discussing landscaping contracts and upcoming events, but she barely got 3 sentences out before a man named Tom Rodriguez stood up and interrupted her. "We're not here to talk about landscaping," Tom said loudly. "We're here to talk about the fact that you dumped toxic waste into a creek, and now we're all potentially liable for environmental crimes." Patricia's face flushed. The board acted in the best interests of the community by finding cost-effective solutions to our material disposal needs. "You poisoned a creek." This came from a woman I recognized as living a few streets over. "There are criminal charges. We could all lose our homes if the fines and cleanup costs get assessed against the HOA." "The board followed proper procedures," Patricia insisted, but her voice was shaky now. "We took a vote. It was democratic." I stood up. "You were told it was illegal." "The contractor you hired told you it was illegal. You did it anyway at night to hide what you were doing. That's not a cost-effective solution. That's a crime." The room erupted in angry voices. People were shouting questions, demanding answers, asking how the board could have been so reckless. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man named Bill Chen, who I'd barely ever seen, actually stood up and announced his immediate resignation, stating that he'd voted against the dumping and had documentation to prove it. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was useless. Someone made a motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board. Someone else seconded it. Within 15 minutes, the entire board except Bill Chen, who produced emails showing he'd objected to the dumping, had been voted out. An interim board was elected on the spot, with Tom Rodriguez as temporary president and a mandate to cooperate fully with the criminal investigation and begin damage control. Patricia left the meeting without saying another word, her face red with anger and what might have been embarrassment. I watched her go and felt no sympathy. She'd been given multiple opportunities to understand the seriousness of what had happened, and she'd chosen to double down every time. The new interim board held an emergency session right after the main meeting. They voted to immediately hire an environmental attorney and begin cooperating with all investigation requests. They also voted to pursue legal action against Patricia and the former board members personally, seeking to recover costs and shield the general HOA membership from liability. Tom asked me to stay and give a full accounting of what had happened, which I did, walking them through everything from finding the first dead fish to the current state of the investigation. "We're going to fix this," Tom said after I finished. "I don't know how much it's going to cost or how long it's going to take, but we're going to make this right." He looked at me directly. "And I'm personally apologizing to you, Marcus. Your property has been damaged, your creek has been poisoned, and you tried to warn people. I'm sorry we didn't listen sooner." The criminal case moved forward through the legal system over the next few months. The district attorney's office, taking the environmental violations seriously, assigned a senior prosecutor to the case. Patricia and the 3 other former board members who'd voted for the dumping were formally arraigned on multiple charges. Patricia faced the most serious charges, including felony violations of environmental laws and criminal negligence. The preliminary hearings were held at the Buncombe County Courthouse in downtown Asheville. I attended as a witness, sitting through hours of testimony from environmental experts, wildlife officers, and the contractor who done the actual dumping. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of the dead wildlife, water testing results showing dangerous contamination levels, documentation that Patricia had been explicitly warned the dumping was illegal, but had ordered it done anyway. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she'd been acting in her capacity as HOA president and hadn't understood the environmental implications. The prosecutor demolished that argument by producing the contractor's text messages, which included multiple warnings that the dumping violated state and federal law, followed by Patricia's responses insisting it was fine because the board had authorized it. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Rebecca Morrison, was clearly unimpressed. During one exchange, when Patricia's attorney tried to minimize the wildlife deaths, Judge Morrison stopped him mid-sentence. "Counsel, I've reviewed the evidence. We have photographs of over 200 dead fish, dead mammals, dead birds, all directly linked to contamination from material your client ordered dumped into a creek system. The environmental damage extends for miles. This isn't a minor violation. This is exactly the kind of criminal negligence these laws were designed to prevent." Patricia's 3 co-defendants took plea deals relatively quickly. They agreed to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation and restitution. Bill Chen, the board member who'd voted against the dumping, wasn't charged at all. His documentation proved he'd objected in writing and had been overruled by Patricia and the others. Patricia held out, insisting she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd been acting within her authority as HOA president. Her attorney eventually convinced her to accept a plea deal, but only after it became clear that if the case went to trial, she was facing the possibility of serious prison time. The plea hearing was held on a cold morning in late February. I was there, sitting in the gallery with Tom Rodriguez and several other neighbors. Patricia stood before Judge Morrison and formally pleaded guilty to criminal violations of the Clean Water Act, illegal disposal of hazardous materials, and criminal negligence causing death of protected wildlife. Judge Morrison didn't go easy on her. During sentencing, the judge made it clear that environmental crimes had serious consequences, especially when they were committed knowingly and caused extensive damage. Miss Hendricks, you were in a position of authority and trust within your community, Judge Morrison said. You were explicitly warned that your planned actions were illegal, and you chose to proceed anyway, prioritizing saving money over environmental protection and legal compliance. As a direct result of your decisions, a creek system has been contaminated, over 200 fish have died, mammals and birds have died, and a community has been traumatized and financially damaged. Patricia received 2 years in prison, with 18 months suspended, meaning she'd serve 6 months in actual custody followed by 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay a $50,000 fine and contribute $25,000 to the Environmental Remediation Fund. The other board members received probation, fines, and community service requirements. Beyond the criminal case, the civil and environmental consequences were extensive. The HOA was required to conduct a complete cleanup and remediation of the contaminated area under state supervision. The final cost came to $230,000, which had to be paid through a combination of the HOA's reserve fund and special assessments against all properties in Ridgeview Estates. Each homeowner ended up paying around $3,000, which sparked multiple lawsuits against the former board members personally. The cleanup itself took 4 months. Environmental contractors removed all the dumped asphalt waste, excavated contaminated soil from the creek bed and banks, and implemented a restoration plan designed by aquatic ecologists. They removed sediment, replaced it with clean substrate, replanted native vegetation, and installed monitoring equipment to track water quality recovery. I watched the work from my property, seeing my creek slowly return to something resembling its former state. The water cleared. The chemical smell faded. By late spring, Officer Chen stopped by to tell me that fish had been reintroduced to the creek and early monitoring showed they were surviving. It would take years for the ecosystem to fully recover, but the immediate crisis was over. The HOA itself underwent dramatic changes. Tom Rodriguez and the interim board worked with homeowners to completely rewrite the covenants and bylaws, implementing oversight and accountability measures that would prevent any future board from acting with the kind of unchecked authority Patricia had wielded. They established quarterly financial audits, required board decisions above certain dollar amounts to be approved by general membership vote, and created an environmental committee to review any proposed activities that might affect common areas near natural features. Patricia served her 6 months at a minimum security facility in Raleigh. I never saw her again after her sentencing. Tom told me she'd sold her house while in custody and moved out of state immediately upon release. The other former board members stayed in the neighborhood, keeping low profiles and working to pay off their fines and legal obligations. For me, the aftermath was complicated. My property values had taken a hit because of the contamination, though the successful cleanup helped mitigate that. I'd spent hundreds of hours dealing with the investigation, the legal proceedings, and the cleanup coordination. But I'd also seen a community come together when it mattered, seen people take responsibility and work to fix a terrible mistake. Officer Chen became something of a friend through the process. She stopped by one Saturday in early June, about a year after the initial contamination, to see how the creek was recovering. We walked the stream bed together, and she pointed out positive signs I'd been too inexperienced to recognize. Native insects returning. Algae growing on the rocks, which meant the ecosystem was producing food for fish again. A great blue heron that had taken up residence near the willow tree. "This is actually a pretty remarkable recovery," she said. "I've seen contamination cases where the damage was permanent. The fact that you caught it early, that we were able to document everything and force a proper cleanup, that made all the difference." She looked at me. "You did the right thing, calling it in immediately. A lot of people would have tried to handle it quietly or would have just accepted the HOA's explanation." I thought about Patricia, about her absolute certainty that she had the authority to do whatever she wanted. I don't understand how someone gets to that point, where they think rules just don't apply to them. Officer Chen shrugged. "I see it more often than you'd think. People get a little bit of power, and they convince themselves they know better than everyone else. HOA boards, small-time politicians, middle managers. They start making exceptions, cutting corners, and eventually they're committing actual crimes and genuinely believing they've done nothing wrong." We stood by the creek in the June sunshine, watching the clear water flow over clean rocks. It would never be exactly what it had been before the contamination, but it was alive again, recovering, rebuilding. I could work with that. The legal and financial fallout continued for another year. Multiple civil lawsuits were filed and settled. The HOA's insurance situation became a nightmare of claims and counterclaims. Several homeowners who'd been particularly damaged by the special assessments successfully sued the former board members personally, recovering some of their costs. I filed my own civil suit, seeking damages for the contamination of my property and the loss of use during the cleanup period. It was settled out of court, with Patricia's homeowner's insurance covering most of it and Patricia personally paying the remainder. The money didn't really make up for watching my creek die, but but it helped cover my legal expenses and compensated me for the property damage. The preserve manager, Robert Martinez, became an ally in pushing for stronger environmental protections in the county. He used the Ridgeview Estates case as an example when lobbying for stricter regulations on development near waterways and increased penalties for environmental violations. Some of those changes were eventually adopted by the county commission. By the time everything was finally resolved, nearly 2 years had passed since I'd first found those dead fish. Ridgeview Estates had transformed from a place where an autocratic HOA board did whatever it wanted into a community with robust democratic processes and real accountability. Property values had recovered. The creek was healthy again, restocked with fish and supporting wildlife. I was sitting on my porch on a Saturday morning in early summer, drinking coffee and watching a doe and her fawn drink from the creek when Tom Rodriguez stopped by. He'd become the permanent HOA president, elected properly this time, and he'd done a good job managing the aftermath of the disaster. "Wanted to give you an update," Tom said, accepting my offer of coffee. "The last of the civil suits were settled last week. The HOA's finances are finally stable again. We've even managed to rebuild some of the reserve fund." "That's good news," I said. "How are the other homeowners doing?" "Better. I think everyone's realized that paying attention to what the board does is actually important. We've got 70% attendance at HOA meetings now, which is unheard of. People are engaged." He paused. "I also wanted to thank you again. If you hadn't caught the contamination when you did, if you hadn't pushed back against Patricia and insisted on bringing in the authorities, this could have been so much worse." I thought about that. It was already pretty bad. It was, but it could have been catastrophic. If the contamination had spread further into the preserve, if it had reached the larger creek system downstream, we'd be talking about damage measured in millions of dollars and decades of recovery time. You stopped that from happening. After Tom left, I walked down to the creek one more time. The water was clear, flowing steadily over rocks that showed no trace of the black residue that had coated them 2 years ago. Fish moved in the shallows. A kingfisher dove from an overhanging branch, coming up with a small trout. The willow tree had grown fuller, its branches hanging low over the water in that graceful way willows do. I'd bought this property for peace and quiet, for a connection to nature, for the simple pleasure of living near a mountain creek. Patricia and her HOA board had taken that away through a combination of arrogance, ignorance, and criminal negligence. But the system had worked. The environmental laws had teeth. The agencies charged with protecting wildlife had done their jobs. The legal system had held people accountable. Patricia had faced criminal charges, had been convicted, had served time in prison. The other board members had been punished. The HOA had been forced to conduct a proper cleanup and implement real reforms. It hadn't been quick or easy or cheap, but justice had been served and the damage had been repaired as much as possible. Standing by my creek that summer morning, watching it flow clean and clear through my property, I felt something like peace returning. The environmental crime had been terrible, the damage extensive, the aftermath exhausting, but it was over now. The criminals had been caught and punished. The creek had been saved. The community had learned its lesson. I thought about Officer Chen's words about people who convince themselves the rules don't apply to them. Patricia had been so certain of her authority, so confident that being HOA president gave her the power to ignore environmental laws. She'd been wrong, and she'd paid for that mistake with her freedom, her money, and her reputation. The HOA still existed, of course. We still had rules about mailbox heights and trash can visibility. But there was oversight now, accountability, recognition that authority came with responsibility. The new board worked for the community rather than ruling over it. They consulted experts before making decisions. They followed the law. It seemed like such a simple concept, following the law, but apparently it had to be learned the hard way. Patricia had dumped asphalt waste into my creek. Fish and game had found dead wildlife throughout the affected area. She and her co-conspirators had faced criminal charges, had been convicted, had been punished. The system worked, even if it took time and effort and the involvement of multiple agencies and a lot of angry homeowners. I went back to my house, poured another cup of coffee, and settled into a chair on the porch. The morning was beautiful, clear and warm, with a gentle breeze coming down from the mountains. In the distance, I could hear the creek flowing steadily over its rocky bed, the sound I'd fallen in love with when I first toured this property 3 years ago. The sound had gone silent during the contamination, when the water had been too poisoned to support the insects and small creatures that made the subtle sounds of a healthy stream ecosystem. But it was back now, that gentle symphony of life that came from clean water flowing through a thriving natural environment. My phone buzzed with a text from Officer Chen. She'd attached a photo of the creek taken from the preserve, showing a completely recovered stream bed with visible fish and clear water. Her message read, "Official monitoring complete. Creek system rated as fully recovered. Nice work keeping the pressure on. This is what environmental law is supposed to accomplish." I smiled and sent back a reply thanking her for all her work. Then I put the phone away and just sat there, listening to my creek, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, enjoying the peace that came from knowing that when something wrong had happened, people had stepped up to make it right. The environmental crime had been serious. The contamination had been extensive. The legal consequences had been significant. But in the end, justice had prevailed. Patricia and her board had dumped toxic waste into a protected waterway. They'd killed wildlife. They'd damaged an entire ecosystem. And they'd been caught, prosecuted, and punished for their crimes. The creek flowed clean again, the fish had returned, the wildlife had recovered, my property was restored. The HOA had learned its lesson about accountability and the rule of law. It had taken 2 years, countless hours of work, significant financial costs, and the involvement of multiple government agencies, but the right outcome had been achieved. I sat on my porch as the morning turned to afternoon, watching the creek flow past my property, listening to the sounds of a recovered ecosystem, feeling grateful that I lived in a place where environmental laws meant something, and where people who broke those laws faced real consequences. Patricia had dumped asphalt waste into my creek, and she'd paid the price for that crime. The system worked.